I'm joined today by Bob Monks, shareholder activist, and dare I say, if you'll allow me, a guru of corporate governance. Do you find that your activist approach puts boards off, or are they listening to what you're saying?
Very simply, yes.
Yes and yes, or just yes?
The great difficulty is this, is that boards have functioned in a particular way for a long time, and while they may recognize that it doesn't always work as well as they'd like, the idea that complete outsiders should be able to come in and should be able to raise questions, should be able to command their attention, this is very off-putting.
You've been a director on 10 boards or something.
I have been a director of a lot of companies,
Yeah.
but that doesn't mean to say that the company I'm talking to really welcomes you were thought of as being intrusive in many ways.
I have been thought of as being intrusive. I hear what you're saying.
Yeah.
But do you feel as if the shareholder spring movement and things like Occupy Wall Street, I mean, some people think it's been a bit of a damp squib, but I actually think it's really opened up a conversation that maybe wasn't happening publicly. Do you think it's made a difference in your work?
You know, I think that there's a real difference between what's happening in the United States and what happens here. I think here that the question of corporate governance is a serious question, and that people really want to try to figure out a way in which the various interests can communicate with each other. In America, the situation is actually quite contrary. In America, it's a matter of power. Those that have the power in the United States don't want to change.
But don't you think that, I mean, I agree with you to a certain extent, and actually I don't think it's so different here, but is it still?
I think it's changed a great deal in this country. I mean, I think starting with the Cadbury Commission, which really is the sort of ancestor of all of these changes in corporate governance, the idea was that this was an open process and that people were entitled to understand what was going on, and directors had to be accountable, and they couldn't simply say, it's my job to do the job and your job to let me do it.
And the U.S.?
In the U.S., for example, in the U.S., you can't get rid of a director.
I mean, here I suppose in the U.K. you can be struck off as a director.
Readily. You can have an AGM with, what, 5% of the vote can call an AGM, have it in about 20 days, and you can get rid of the director with a majority of those present.
But also, I mean, don't you feel that now that things are opening up a bit more, there's also public pressure, and institutions are beginning to feel more empowered about pressure. And organizations like ISS, I mean, you started ISS, you know, it plays a big role in that as well.
I think that there is now a consciousness that directors as individuals have a responsibility to the shareholders, to the community. And I think that that's different. I think that's changed. I think that directors do feel that they are held to account.
So how do you define a bad director?
I define a bad director as someone who doesn't ask questions.
Well, I agree. I mean, you were on the board of Tyco and overlapped with Kozlowski and so on. I mean, what do you do in a situation where you know the chief executive, either the remuneration is out of control, or you know, or you? I mean, there must have been some indication that this guy was on the train to Crazy Town.
Well, the first time I knew was when I was asked to leave the board. As I was on the compensation committee, and
right.
I didn't agree with what they did. And so I ultimately was asked to leave the board.
So there is some way to get you off the board. They just have to ask.
It's a practical matter, yeah. It's a practical matter, yes. Yeah, it's hard, though. I was quite worried because I thought the situation was bad, and I don't know how, if you're a director and you think the situation is bad, how do you get off a board? Because you have an obligation, in effect, as a director, to try to fix it.
Yes.
And so, can you just walk off? And if you walk off, do you walk off quietly, or do you walk off and try and get some public understanding of why you're walking off? Difficult questions.
I mean, what advice would you give to new board directors who, you know, and this new generation of people going into the boardroom who actually see their role as having integrity and being stewards and having a responsibility and being active and engaged?
Your only responsibility is to ask questions. I mean, that is really the thing that is so simple, and yet so few people seem to be comfortable with that.
And what do you do with the answers? If you're not happy with the answer?
You have to keep asking questions.
Yeah.
You have to keep persisting. Because if you're uncomfortable, the reason why you're there is to provide a kind of reality check.
Right.
And hopefully, between the board, with a very open inquiry process, you can get some kind of feeling when things aren't right.
Bob, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down. There's so much more for us to talk about. We'll have to do it again. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lucy.